Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you might be. Thanks for checking out the video. So my name is Dr. Andrew Hill. If you haven't met before, nice to meet you. Please look me up and leave a comment and tell me all about your brain. So this is the Neurofeedback and Chill weekly live stream where we tend to dig into a topic or two while doing some neurofeedback and demystifying that for folks. As usual, I want to verify that I have adequate audio and adequate video. So if you're hanging out and showing up, please give me a wave or a check-in so we can make sure that the live stream's working okay. And tonight I wanted to talk about left versus right brain training. And I've been doing these live streams for 9 months or something. And you'll find one from a couple months ago that has a lot of left versus right brain discussion. And that one I think focuses a little more on the organization, the laterality, the left-right division of labor, so to speak, within the brain. And I do talk a little bit about ways to train. And this taps into the idea that the left hemisphere has a more approach and focus-driven set of circuits, and the right is more about avoiding and pulling back. So if those topics seem interesting, you can dig more into them with those videos. I'll make sure they are on the end cards for this video once this one's done. And the essential topic tonight is, again, talking about left versus right hemisphere stuff. But I wanted to talk a little more about the ways we might actually train the brain, the neurofeedback process. So again, if we haven't met, I'm Andrew Hill. I have a company called Peak Brain that does neurofeedback all around the world, and we help people understand their brains using QEEG brain mapping. If you want to come check us out, we have physical offices in Manhattan, Los Angeles, St. Louis, and Orange County, California. And we also have some pop-ups in London and Stockholm and a few more to come. So if you want to come check us out, please do. And anyone who's watching or checking out this stream, you're welcome to a discount brain map where we'll give you unlimited EEGs in any office for about $250 a year. So the best deal in the world for EEG acquisition. So hey folks who are showing up. Hey El Chatterino, nice to see you. Thanks for the audio check. I appreciate that. I saw the email actually today. I have to get back still to you via email, or I think maybe to your dad. I hope you guys are doing well, who's out there in YouTube land. And again, left-right hemisphere stuff tonight. And from the point of view of neurofeedback, there's a couple of basic things to start thinking about. And I'm going to set myself up for a neurofeedback session here shortly and show you some more of the details. But the general idea in neurofeedback, if we go back, 50, 60 years to the start of the field, a lot of the initial training was sort of accomplished under what became an arousal model. The idea that individual bits of cortex that had functional significance or functional specialization could tune themselves by making a combination of alphas, thetas, beta waves, other frequencies, and sort of create this informational mode that would change based on which brain waves were dominant, which brain waves were showing up more in that tissue. And it's oversimplifying. It's still useful to think about, but it's oversimplifying. However, alpha is sort of that neutral between the gears. Beta is the gas pedal. High frequency beta is the gas pedal revving, little beta spindles. Theta brain waves, which are slower than alpha, is a release circuit that takes the brakes off and allows things to happen in specialized tissue. And then delta is more of the heartbeat of the brain. That is the twice per second background tone of the brain. You sort of live in it, you don't think in it. And it drives immune system and the heart and lungs and deep sleep and learning when to sleep and growth and repair and all that life stuff in the brain driven by delta. In fact, delta creates this 2 hertz pressure wave, a fluid wave that washes the brain at night. Just like your brain's on an agitation cycle like a washing machine, we get one of those happening because of nighttime delta surges. Slow wave sleep is delta, for instance. So we have all these brainwaves happening in modules, but one thing that is different in the left and right hemispheres is that the left hemisphere is a bit more modular. It's a bit more isolated in its modules. So when we're talking about a module, we're talking about combinations of what are called micro columns or mini columns. You'll see both names used. I know it's kind of confusing, but it's one of them is the voltage, one of them is the size, essentially. And what these micro columns or mini columns are cortical structures that are the same electrically. As you move a wire down through them, you would get the same electrical field, the sum field they would share. And these columns are made up of somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 or 40,000 neurons, and probably double that in glial cells. So there's about 100,000 cells hanging out in a little block, a little building that is doing all kinds of information processing within it, and then exchanging messages to nearby buildings and faraway buildings where different floors, imagine a 6-story building, and the cortex is a 6-layered structure in most places, and different layers will send clotheslines to adjacent buildings, and some layers will send faraway lines to other buildings that are across town, and that'll coordinate some of the communication between different parts of the brain. But by looking at what the resting patterns are, how much of alpha or how fast the alpha is, or how much beta, how little theta, etc., you can start to make guesses about the functional significance of the brain. And when looking at these patterns in the left hemisphere versus the right, you start to see that many of the clusters, the patterns, the phenotypes, they run a little hotter on the left side. So beta waves at C3 and the same functional beta waves at C4 will run at a different speed because the left hemisphere has fewer of these long distance connections between regions. So most of the neurons running between chunks of tissue are inhibitory. They pump the brakes a little bit and dampen information flow. And with a reduced amount of inhibitory interneurons, the left hemisphere modules end up running a little bit more on their own. They run a little bit hotter with less input, and they tend to act a bit more in beta, faster frequencies in beta, often in the teens, in terms of natural frequency, a healthy frequency. You'll see people running lots of beta waves up in the 15, 16, 17, 18 hertz range, and it's functionally appropriate and feels really good. On the right-hand side, similar tissues in the middle of the head, let's say, would run beta a bit lower, 12, 13, 14, 15 hertz, for the same functional significance of stabilizing the job of those tissues on each side. So the first thing we notice is that the left hemisphere is a little bit faster in general than the right hemisphere. And this is true of all the brain waves. You'll see it in beta, you'll see it in alpha, and you start to get a sense of the spreading out or the slowing down within a hemisphere becomes important when looking at things like speed of processing or mood. That's about the alpha synchronization within the hemisphere, but left and right had different jobs. So left is more driven by the tasks of approach and reaching out and sinking your teeth in and motivating. Left typically has a lot of language resources for most humans. That's where language is dominant. The left also has a lot of systems involved with turning on behavior, stabilizing behavior, continuing behavior, also staying asleep. And the right is more about shaping and supervising in the middle of the brain. We have a supervisor that knows if you're paying attention, that knows if you're a squirrel, and helps you pull back from the shiny objects or not be fidgety. We have an area in the front right whose job it is to pull back on things that take too much effort or are frustrating or are potentially adversive in some way. So the frontal lobes do this approach versus avoid dance where the kid in the left frontal lobe goes, hi, yay, come here. And on the right front corner, there's a character going, this sucks, go away, it's all too hard, leave me alone. And those characters, they balance essentially the approach versus the avoid systems in the frontal corners. And the front middle's job is to reconcile those. That's why we can get a little bit stuck. And in some ways, you can think about the lack of reconciliation, the lack of deciding who's in charge is a big feature of many things we suffer from, like procrastination. You can go watch my video on avoidance and procrastination that talks a lot about the physiology. But the idea is that they're shared systems. So in general, when doing brain training, you have to think about the specialized tissue you're training, the phenotypes or the patterns the person has, but also the sort of way you might be relating to the other hemisphere. So to back up for a second, some of my my PhD research was looking at how the brain was reacting to neurofeedback. So let me take my headset off and set myself up for some neurofeedback while we are exploring that idea. I'm going to get rid of the video topic here. And where's my title? There it is. Okay, so let me go into Eager and set up a session. Show title. There we go. Guessing you guys can still hear me. El Chatarino has a question. So FZ is the traffic warden? Kinda, yeah. It holds what's important. It reconciles competing ideas. It helps you hold value, decide what's important. There's some evidence we may feel love in some aspects of the anterior cingulate. So it's an interesting structure. Very heavily involved with the intersection of attention and anxiety in some ways. So let me set up my Eager. And I'm going to do some of those left and right areas. That left side is C3. It's involved with stabilizing attention. And the right side is C4. It's involved with supervising attention. So together, these areas would be involved with, let me select the client. These areas are involved with both sleep and executive function, the ones that I'm going to train tonight. So let me set up a plan. And I'm going to do, let's see. So we'll start off with this is right side training. This is set up fine for right side training, C4 minus A2. Let me put in some additional segments here ahead of this. So I'm going to insert before a couple times, make that one a setup. Oh, sorry, a setup, not a run. And that's a C3, C3A1. So we'll do this one at 4 to 7 hertz. So this is the inhibit, or a range of brain waves I'm going to allow the game to run only when these brain waves are going down or staying down. We have a reward, and as I said, the left hemisphere runs faster. So I'm going to run this left one at 17.75 and at the top edge, and 14.75 on the bottom edge. And the right hemisphere, I'm actually running this. Oh, is there a typo in there? There probably is. 14.75, 24 to 36. The numbers in the reward and the high inhibit are faster than they were on the other side. Let me set my auto goals up. Oops, cancel. Auto goal settings. If you work with us at Peak Brain and you're confused by what I'm doing right now, the auto goals, it's because we set these up for you in general. So you shouldn't have to go in and fiddle with these, but doing a vanilla config, I'll have to set them up. So what I'm doing is setting the software up. So every 30 seconds, it's going to adjust the software and then get next to where my brain is in the amounts of different brain waves. And then it'll wait for my brain to flex itself a little bit in the right direction, so to speak, for the workout. And that will applaud my brain for movement, essentially. So it'll teach my brain to move a little bit. That's the biofeedback process. I'll show you in real time. Let me do 12 minutes on the left side and then 12 minutes on the right. I'll do a decent session today. Okay. So let me go back and answer any questions while I set myself up and tell you more stories about the hemispheres. So, one of the reasons we have to think about training both hemispheres is because we are affecting both hemispheres. When you stick a wire on the left-hand side, minus the right, half of the signal you're getting under that electrode is still from everywhere else in the brain mixed together. So while you can play some tricks to get better localization of signals, it's not the easiest process in the world to get good spatial localization in EEG, especially in a real-time way. Any processing you would do would add time lag. So if you did some source analysis called Loretta, you can do that offline, but doing it real-time, you have a lot of compromises. All right, so I have some ear clips out. You can see here some silver ear clips. I'm going to put these in my head. And I have some electrolyte paste, just some basic tacky conductive paste. There's an art to this, so I'll show you if you're interested. You hold the electrodes like that, and then you scrape the inside of the bucket. You load up the surfaces with paste. So there we go. And then I'm going to hang this so the electrode wire is away from my neck to avoid any mechanical disturbance. Then the other side, the same way. Okay. So finding my ears is not that hard. I kind of know where they are. But head locations can be a little tricky, especially in yourself. So let me make sure I have the right wires out. I'm going to grab one that's not tangled up and put it aside. And I have cats, so I got to make sure to get the rest of the wires hidden away before they see them, or I'll have to buy new ones. If you have cats and you also do neurofeedback, it's one of the downfalls. Cats love wires, maybe more than neurofeedback providers do. All right, so I have an amplifier here to measure my EEG called a U-Wiz, an old school amplifier. It's a 2-channel amp with a bunch of sockets on it. So I'm going to start off with a C3 minus A1. A1, odd number is my left ear. So I'm going to plug that into the black. Red minus black on this amp is the first channel, so we're going to use that for both sessions today. The right ear is the ground. That goes in the green socket. And then on my head, I'm going to start off with a C3. Goes in the red socket. And for my head, we're going to use a flat silver wire, real basic one. And you can see it. Maybe not. There it is. And for this one, I just want to make sure that I have a little bit of paste covering the wire. And then since I'm bald, I'm going to put a dab of paste on my head in that location. So this is my left side. There we go. Let's see how close I got. Pretty close. I know I have a couple of neurofeedback providers on the chat right now. What do you guys think? Pretty close, C3? I won't be offended if you think I should double check. All right, so now we have 3 wires in the amp, and that's going to let me measure electricity off my head. And that electricity will get measured and filtered into 3 different bands: theta, beta, and high frequency beta. And this is that 14 and change. So let me start the software. And let's run a simple game, a puzzle piece game called Formation. Oh, let me make sure my screens are set up properly. Let's see. So where is that game screen? Let's see. There it is. Okay, so bottom right-hand corner is going to be a game. And until we see the game, you can see there's other squiggles on the screen. The top squiggle is the raw signal. And when I move my head, you can see that it's moving. If I clench my jaw, you can see it's going to jump. That's muscle tension. When I'm sitting still, it'll be just basic brain waves getting pulled off on that complete squiggle. And then we will filter out 3 different frequency ranges. So this one here that I've highlighted is 4 to 7 hertz. You can see it's a slower brainwave, has wider spacing. And then this one is 14.75. There's a fast one here, 24 to 36. But if I'm highlighting here the 4 to 7, I guess my head is covering it. Let me move that a little bit. There we go. You can see 4 to 7 hertz below my head. That's the frequency we're measuring. We're getting right now 18 and change microvolts of that 17 and change of the theta brainwaves that I'm pulling off my head right here on the upper left. The threshold, the number that's highlighted in red, says THR 23. And what that is, it's the lines around the brainwave I'm creating. That's an amplitude cap, essentially. So whenever my brain stays below that range or inside the lines, it's not going to have a red line through it, and that will allow the game to run. And the other thing's true for the other brainwaves. So this one here is 14.75 or a more fast beta. And for that one, you can see that my average is 7.9, and I set a threshold at, it says 8. And that's not going to work because you want to reward a band. So let me go ahead and hit the threshold button. Why is that not where? There it goes. And then hit F11. There we go. Okay. So what I just did was adjusted the threshold. Now my THR number says 6.25 and my average is 8.5. So my average is outside or higher than the threshold, which is what you want for a reward band. Now you can see whenever that beta brainwave, that 14.75 brainwave is outside of its lines, it's getting a green strike through line saying that you're on the proper side of the threshold. And then the third band, 24 to 36, is another inhibit. So essentially the computer's going to watch my brain, and whenever my brain spends a half a second moving or staying in the right direction in these 3 brainwaves, the game will run. Thanks, Joshua, for the vetting of the placements. Appreciate it. Let me kick off the game here, F5. Now it's running. What did we do to the circle? Oh, where's the display? All right, so turn up the audio. You hear those beeps probably happening now? Looks like I have this game in default mode. I just did a reinstall of the software, and so I like to set it up so this game gives me a random display, but right now it's going in order, so I think I must have overwritten the defaults with the defaults. So this is a game called Formation. What's happening is whenever my brain spends half a second moving or staying on the right side of the thresholds, we get a beep, and we get a picture grid, square being dropped away. And I've turned the volume down a little bit, so you can probably barely hear it. This game screen, the picture grid's actually an eye line on a big TV for me. So my brain is hearing the beep stop and start and seeing the visuals stop and start. And it's mostly an involuntary training process. So back to why you need to think about training both hemispheres at once. Now, we know the circuits are interrelated. The left side, C3, is a stabilizer of vigilance and deep sleep. The right side, C4, is the supervisor executive. And those work really powerfully together. And failures under those areas, or weaknesses, if you will, produce things we often call stuff like ADD on the left and ADHD on the right, colloquially. But it's more than that. It's more than just that you want to think about complementary structures and complementary training. There's actually connections and resonance and behavior between these 2 locations on either side. You know, for my grad work at UCLA, a lot of what I did was look at what was happening during the process of neurofeedback. So I took electrodes at C3 and C4 like this. And then on top of them, I put a 64-channel cap using a piece of tech called biosemi, which is a DC coupled amplifier. It goes down to 0 all the way up to like 2000 hertz. So a really wide range of frequencies being picked up over a good density of placements on the head. And using the neurofeedback process, you can hear there's a beep happening at the same time. There's a square unveiling. I took that synchronous event and I sent that into the 64-channel record as an event, and then clipped out the couple thousand events per half-hour game session and created averaged EEGs called ERPs or evoke potentials, and looked at how the brain was reacting to the neurofeedback. In this case, I'm rewarding 14.75. And what I found was the brain will create an amplitude burst, a desynchronization in time and an increase in amplitude in the frequency rewarding. So whenever my beta goes up, the beep happens, and my brain will respond by bursting the beta a little bit, kind of a nice little round trip. And I discovered this by doing a double-blind, placebo-controlled study. So I looked at about 45 or so UCLA students, 4 groups, 46, 4 groups, and it was an asymmetric weighting where about 24 of them were in a sham group, unbeknownst to me, and the rest were either C3 training or C4 training. And I set everyone up with C3 and C4 electrodes, put the cap on their head, ran neurofeedback for 5 days in a row, and I gathered the full head channels on days 1, 3, and 5. And I watched how neurofeedback evolved, how the brain started to learn, when it started to learn. Was it I compared the first 10 minutes to the second 10 minutes to the third 10 minutes of each half hour. I looked at the evolution of those within the 30 minutes across different days, and looked at how the brain was yoking to the information. How does the brain know that it's being applauded? Where's that information loop coming from? And we found it in this thing called the ERSP, or event-related spectral perturbation, that increase of amplitude and shift in time in the brainwave that was just applauded by the stimulus. Pretty cool. I was excited. They gave me a PhD for it. They were excited. But doing secondary analysis with a group in Northern California called PACDEL, Pacific Development Technology, with Len Trejo, we did a lot of deep analysis of those data sets, looking at the mechanisms of neurofeedback, because we were finding that in the QEEG and the flat maps, even though you were getting change in people's experience, in general, we weren't seeing always change within a session. And so since I had such good session data, we dug into my data and looked at the within session effects versus the change across a week. Now, most neurofeedback providers will tell you it takes several days, maybe several weeks, to start feeling anything. But my research showed that within the very first 10 minutes, every single person doing real neurofeedback, their brain started to react to the frequency being applauded. And those doing sham neurofeedback, it did not. And I should unpack what we were doing for placebo or sham, because people always wonder. So neurofeedback, as you can see, is happening. But in a sham case, what would be happening is the computer would realize I was a sham subject in a special, hidden, locked away, blinded study module. You can bring somebody else in to lock away things, essentially. And then it grabs one of your subjects, like if I was a study subject or a sham subject, it would, instead of grabbing real EEG on the screen here, it would grab several segments of stored EEG that were not mine. It would scale them all to match my EEG. It would shuffle their order. It would stitch them together, and then it would blend that bogus file, if you would, the non-contingent file. It would blend that with my real EEG for the display on the screen here, so that movements and coughs and blinks and turning it off and pulling a wire off all act like you would expect. But the beeps and the change in the game were only being driven by the non-contingent EEG, the EEG that wasn't theirs. So that sham group still got an auditory P200. The beep still creates a sensory event, but you don't see the event-related spectral perturbation, the ERSP, or the high-frequency burst in the brainwave that you're rewarding if it's a sham. So that was the bulk of, maybe a third of my PhD work, was looking at the mechanism of neurofeedback. A lot of it was actually looking at left and right hemispheric specialization, and how training at C3 and C4 created different effects on attention in the two hemispheres. And I started to see that in my C4 group, we were getting, sometimes for some aspects of attention, more of a left hemisphere effect. And for my C3 group, we were getting left and right hemisphere effects as well. So it didn't look like, when I say hemisphere effects in attention, I don't mean the change in the EEG. With Dr. Trejo, we sort of figured out that a really bizarre phenomena is only about 50% of people show a trend under the training electrodes while training neurofeedback in a session. Even with change across time, within a session, you don't reliably see a change in the thing you're training, even though the brain still does learn from it and will create a change later on. But in digging in to figure out how the brain was doing this, we did a bunch of things you might do in fMRI, where you're looking at source localization, NPM kind of stuff, statistical parametric mapping. And what we found was, in a very clear way, for a lot of people, when you're doing neurofeedback at C4, you get an evoked potential at C4, but you get a different effect over time, a change effect at C4 and at C3. So while the training is local, some of the long-term change you're getting is happening elsewhere in the brain, not under the location you're training, but in areas it's connected to. So this might give you a sense already about if you train one side and not the homotopic side, you might be creating more of a bias and less of a balance in your training. Ooh, some new pictures in this game. That's nice. All right, so I've done 9 minutes here, 3 minutes per segment for this game. And I'm going to go another few minutes, and then I'll change the wire over to the right-hand side. So anyways, as we were digging in, Dr. Trejo and I, into this big data set and realizing, well, wait a minute, only half of the people in that group experienced change in session. And the trend changes that showed up over a week or two for that group and for some other data we have, we would get effects under the electrodes sometimes and often elsewhere in the brain for long-term change, atoms of change, essentially. Dr. Trejo did some cool work at Pactel looking at something in the EEG called atoms, which are like, just what it sounds like, almost little units that aren't divisible any further. And some of those are predictive. Like we were working with the Navy, trying to help them figure out if there was an atom in the EEG that would predict visual fatigue. And we were sending information into different visual hemispheres for people scanning screens. So as they got tired, you could shift which hemisphere the information being sent into using visual tracking and divided vision, eye trackers and things. So pretty cool stuff, but the left and right hemisphere, as we dug in further and further, we find complementary homotopic. The same site would be impacted sometimes. So I had already been trained in neurofeedback when I got to UCLA, and we had this left-right hemisphere arousal model, left running faster, there's front to back divisions. As you go more forward in the brain, things get faster. As you go back in the brain, things get slower. As you go left, things get faster. As you go right, things get slower. As you get older, things get faster. As you get very old, they get slow again. So you have this arousal model of how fast things should, quote unquote, run. And against that landscape, brain mapping came into use heavily once the cost came down enough that people could afford those devices. And suddenly we started seeing that there was good agreement in the arousal model as had been discovered and taught and experienced by providers in autism and anxiety and seizure. We were seeing the same kinds of things in the phenotypes and the patterns resting in the QEEG. And when looking at the phenotypes or the functional significance of these two areas, C3 and C4, you realize they do work together, with the left as a stabilizer and the right as a supervisor. Or as you go forward, you end up with Richie Davidson's work, where the left is an approach and the right's an avoid, and really does inform some mood bias, if you will, some positivity versus negativity bias. Richie Davidson, Cliff Sarin, a bunch of those folks did research looking at long-term, lifelong meditators, nuns and monks and things. And there's a strong correlation with a left dominance with the meditating for longer and longer. And there's an emotional signature in the brain of approach versus avoid. Cliff Sarin and B. Alan Watts did a bunch of really interesting research showing nuns, these monks and nuns, intense pictures of suffering and looking how the brain reacted. And they saw strong changes in their brains compared to typical brains based on how long they had been meditating or praying and how old they were. Essentially, contemplative work changes the structure of your brain, including this left-right laterality. So, all right, I'm halfway through. Let me look at some questions here. Hey, Madeline, how are you tonight? Would the bilateral effect be independent of reference point left or right? That's a great question. It's a very, very sophisticated question. No. I mean, yes, because half the signal is going to be from everywhere else in the brain combined. But you're going to get a different training effect when you do something like C4 minus A1 and C4 minus A2. Let me put my C4 on here before I fill my screen with noise. So right now I have C4 minus A1 set up. So it's my scalp minus my left ear. And that means that it's going to get some contribution from the left hemisphere because the left ear is not electrically neutral. So I'm going to swap the reference and ground now and change over to a C4 minus A2. And that C4 minus A2 is going to be a much more right hemisphere focused signal. Now, there's still some left hemisphere being picked up in it. Electricity moves around and mixes. But by bracketing the right side and doing a subtraction on the right, one minus the other to create the signal, that's really going to bias the measurement to the right. So my work showed a left hemisphere activation and change over time at C3 with a C4 minus A2 protocol. But if you did a C4 minus A1 protocol, you would also be directly training CZ, C3, and other regions between C4 and A1 with that low beta. It's not a pure localization. So you are getting a little bit of, or a lot of other location trained. Remember, only half of the signal under an electrode comes from that region, and the rest is all other places summed and lagged. So everything else is mixing together and arriving at that location and becoming the other half of the signal. Hey, VJ, nice to see you. So left is more developed than right for meditation. I would say that the asymmetry is different. If you're a long-term meditator, you probably have a better dominant left asymmetry. I believe Cliff Saron also showed that the activation of the right hemisphere under intense grief was stronger for at least the nuns. He was showing them like crises in the world, and their right hemisphere was activating more strongly than typical as well. And they also showed, this was the same study, I believe, that showed that some of these phenomena were also occurring, and the changes in these people were occurring in the gamma frequencies up in the several hundred or several thousand hertz range. Things you can't measure using flat electrodes. Really, flat electrodes, passive electrodes, really only get you up to 38 hertz or so reliably. And so you shouldn't believe gamma with consumer equipment. Only believe gamma when it's very, very expensive equipment. So left and right are both involved, VJ, but I would say the long-term meditator has more cortical thickness. You can look at the work of Lazar, both as a grad student and in her labs since, showing that there's a cortical thinning sparing effect that happens as a direct proportion of how many hours in your life you meditate. The more you meditate, the fat and happier your cortex is. So I'll say that again. The more you meditate, the fatter and the happier your cortex is. So meditate away, get a fat and happy cortex. But it's also the hemispheric dominance, the left versus right. And the right gets too active in depression and anxiety and fear and anger. And that's a resistance the meditator would have. They would control over the excess theta, the excess alpha, the disinhibition modes. So it's not as simple as which one's stronger, but there's a better resilience in balancing the hemispheres in that population. Let's see. Madeline saying, interesting, thought my work was C4A1, even cooler outcome. I'm pretty sure it was C4A2. Someone should look at my dissertation and tell me if I'm wrong. I think it was C4A1, C4A1 active, C4A2 active, and then a sham, which looked like either C3A1 or C4A2. And so it ended up being 12 people active in each group. And then there was like 8 people in each sham group for a total of 16 people in the sham across both versions of it. People could not tell the sham, which was interesting. I was experienced in neurofeedback, pretty experienced by that point. I couldn't tell the sham. I did set them up and leave the room. There was no one watching the neurofeedback happen. I did one protocol for 30 minutes with a full head cap on. So after setting them up, we left the room until the beep stopped and came back in and unhooked them. I also did left-right lateralized attention network testing. So we flashed attention stimuli into the left visual field or right visual field, looking at a central fixation cross in the screen, very rapid flash, and have them respond with left or right hand in a blocked way. And by responding with one hand and flashing something into one visual field, you can test one hemisphere at a time with attention. Because if you're doing central fixation, then the same side of each eye converges in one hemisphere. So the visual field, like the the right visual field in my left eye, the right visual field in my right eye will both converge. The information will converge and end up in my right hemisphere in my occipital area, kind of sorting of visual fields. And so if you flash something into the right visual field and make somebody respond with their left hand with a mouse, the information has never gone into the other hemisphere, and you've just measured on the left-hand side. So I first validated this work measuring all of the split brain subjects that Roger Sperry and Joe Bogan did initial work on. My advisor, Dr. Aran Zaidel, was a grad student himself at Caltech when all that split brain subject was work was happening, and he was involved in it. So late in his life, I would travel around the Western US with him and find these little old ladies and little old men who'd had epilepsy seizures like 30, 40, 50 years before and test their brains because they don't have a corpus callosum. So you can do a pure test and say, is hemispheric attention different in each hemisphere? Is it intact? Is it fully there in each hemisphere? And it was in this surgically separated population. And it turns out that the same performance, the same attention stuff happens within each hemisphere separately, even in intact people, normal people. So looking at this attention test, I then measured the full head neurofeedback system and saw divergent effects in each visual field on the neurofeedback, or from the neurofeedback on the attention testing. So those of you, I see at least one of my employees, I won't name you on the channel unless you want to say hi. This is why we train the way we do at Peak Brain. I see a few clients too. That we have this left-right perspective. We have an arousal model perspective. You'll notice we tune the frequencies a lot. This is where that comes from. It's the old school arousal model layered through a laterality model that I developed of hemispheric attention, layered through things like the CPTs that we use. Those have a bit of a laterality component too because of left side approach and right side avoid, left side activate, right side supervise. So this is that left-right thing we think about when training. And so, oh, did I not start my second session? I did not. I was so excited to talk. Let me go start that. All right, C4 minus A2. Let me hit F4. We changed it over. Now F5. Oh, that was F4, which voids the timer. So let me remember to stop the timer. One of the bugaboos in Eager is if you hit F4 instead of F5, it advances just like F5 does, but also voids the timer. And so you can overtrain if you don't, if you miss it. All right. So other questions here from the Peanut Gallery. Thank you guys for contributing. VJ's asking, could I talk about F4 minus A2 or F8 minus A2 and how those help with decision-making? Is it just greater calm? Decision-making, huh? So F4 and F8 are related areas, and they're over the right dorsolateral PFC. And F8 may also be over the insula, which is more deep, but it's sort of the same area, just a bit deeper. And we think of F4 and F8 in neurofeedback as being areas that are involved with mood and anxiety and anger. F4 can be relaxed with more alpha, and we often get a better mood. Not always. It's not as a reliable area to train. But F8 is somewhat reliable. It tends to feel really calming, really chill. Getting more insula, FT8, more a little bit further back. That's also more chilling, more calming. And we end up with bringing alpha up, bringing relaxing brainwaves up to get those calming effects on the right. On the left, you would want to bring up the beta waves, and that would produce, in some people, a similar effect. So I think if those things are helping with decision-making, there's one of two possibilities, VJ, that seem most likely. One is there was anxiety in the way of decision-making. Extra theta, extra fast beta, making it hard to move, either feeling overwhelmed, filled with dread, frustrated, etc. That can happen. Another piece might be that you just happen to tap into right-sided theta, doing F8 minus A2 or F4 minus A2. You might have gotten some reduction of theta on the more central strips and the FC strips, which we don't generally train directly, but FC, being between F strip and C strip, has some aspects of the F, the mood, and the C, the executive. And so you probably got some FC4, and that will have helped decision-making probably, and dissolving any anxiety at like F8 by bringing up the alpha, bringing down the very fast beta. That can also help lubricate action, because if you aren't resistant, remember the right side resists and avoids. If you dissolve resistance, it might translate to smoother decision-making, perhaps. That's my theory there. And do those touch the prefrontal? Oh, let me answer Radar's question. Skip that. Hey, Radar Ashwood, nice to see you. Why are intrahemispheric protocols like T3 minus T4 and C3 minus C4 stabilizing? The short answer is because of what you're measuring. With a difference protocol like that, measuring within hemispheres, you're not getting a lot of signal. The closer together the electrodes are, the less signal you actually get, because you subtract out a lot of the EEG. So A, you're getting less signal to train, so they're gentle. And B, you're training the homotopic regions. And so you can break up hypercoherence, and you can create that beta resonance that I discovered that happens in the homotopic sites. That works very well for generally the sites that make beta. Doesn't work as well for things like the occipitals, the frontals. I wouldn't necessarily do F3 minus F4, for instance. But C3 minus C4, T3 minus T4, those can work really well because those tissues are those cortical thalamic hubs that are sort of specialized on both sides and do spend some communication energy between each other through the thalamus. So I think that's why those work. I think you're tapping into cortical thalamic and then back to cortex channels on both sides. And I think that's a similar idea like T5 minus T6. Even though it's not going through the central part of the thalamus, it is still a cortical thalamic and a callosal channel going between the posterior temporal lobes. So I think you're just training the relationship of the hemispheres, and it allows another change. It's not just a local amplitude change. So it probably gets into some of the same stuff that infralow and infraslow are doing, because of the relationship can happen in a very low frequency range, not just in oscillations. It's probably getting into a little bit of the general ideas about neurofeedback, that sometimes any signal can help. This is why some of the one-size-fits-all systems can work really well, because a mirror back to the brain for some people can be really, really useful. So I'm not exactly sure, but those are my hand-waving explanations for you, Radar. VJ's asking, do those sites touch the prefrontal, like C3, C4, F3, F4? Yeah. C3 and C4 are the most posterior parts of the frontal lobe. The C sites are frontal lobe. Did you know that? Central sites are frontal lobe. The back of the frontal lobe. And they go down into the thalamus. So the C sites are the mind-body connection. How's them apples? The mind-body connection happens at the sensory motor strip with C3, C4, and CZ. Blow your mind, hopefully, VJ, there. I bet you enjoyed that observation. VJ noticed that the right front, that anxiety and thought regulation was improved. Ah, interesting. I think you're doing combination frontals, which, again, can be gentler. For some people, the combination... Now, just to... I'm sure you won't mind, but you're also doing a dual protocol. So you're doing both sides at once. And both sides at once is a strategic decision that has to do with not just the laterality, not just the individual activation of each tissue, but the rationale and the strategy to co-activate the resource you're talking about. That does not always work for individual resource. It doesn't always make sense for brains in general or for individual people. For some people, doing homotopic sites at the same time is kind of magical and creates an interhemispheric communication, an internal awareness, breaks up deep anxiety, breaks up deep fatigue, really helps cement some focus ability, because you're training not just the individual arousals of the local cortical patches, but the long-distance relationship and the long-distance regulation between these regions that share jobs, like attention or mood. So there's your high-level answer, VJ. I hope that was important. I hope that was useful for you. VJ saying, mine was blown with the sensory stuff. Okay. Mind-body connection with C3, C4 has noticeably improved too. Wonderful, wonderful. And magic, incredible stuff. Well, I mean, I'm a fan, but I am biased. So I'm curious, anyone on the channel right now for the live stream who've never tried neurofeedback? I see a lot of people I recognize. I think you've all tried neurofeedback, at least those of you who are chatting with us right now. We're getting toward the end of our hour, and I have a few more minutes left of neurofeedback. Of course, happy to answer more questions. Those are the general ideas I wanted to cover. The idea of the left being more biased towards leaning in, the right being a bit more careful and supervisory and shaping things, the left running hotter and faster in actual frequencies, but also more modular, so you can push harder on individual modules, the right being more stabilizing, more interconnected. And then we had some great questions about left versus right interhemispheric protocols and bilateral protocols. Yeah. You can also do some fun things in that same direction with some protocols. So I do a lot of alpha theta with people, and often you're doing a 2-channel alpha theta on the parietal lobes, but I do a sum, meaning I measure the raw signals before measuring the thetas and the alphas in the signal, in the combined signal in this case. What that does is it creates a relationship between the two locations you're training, because if you're rewarding amplitude and you're adding raw data together, then if the two sides become in phase, the amount of brain waves doubles. And if the two sides are 180 degrees out of phase, then the amount of measured alpha or theta, whatever it is abolished. It gets deconstructedly interfered with. So by doing a 2-channel sum, bilateral sums, you can do those at the parietals or occipitals or frontals, and you can create this interhemispheric communication across different circuits. The duals do that as well. That's one trick. And then another trick that can be magical is to take some of these bilaterals, and based on the needs of one individual, is you can do regional activations of a bilateral nature. So you aren't just doing F3, F4, you might do F3, F4, and then move back to the C sites and create a much stronger regional frontal lobe activation by doing that. VJ, that's what one of your favorite protocols, I think, is the F7, F8, or F3, A4, followed by a C3 minus C4. We call it a dual, the beta dual. And it's really powerful, and much, much more powerful, I would argue, than either of the things that make it up. And this is true of other sweeps and segmented protocols like Jacqueline Ginsberg's beta reset, and some alpha sweeps that I've created that do multiple alpha theta protocols back to back on a 2-channel nature. Those are more sophisticated, high-level protocols that are about combining the hemispheric communication. And it does take some thought about left versus right, and you generally want to do those sorts of things after you've helped somebody balance the individual resources on each side. Then combining them is a better idea. That's probably what I should say about that, and kind of leave the bilateral training for another video or topic. VJ's agreeing that the dual is his favorite protocol. No, I meant that you would do dual for frontals. I meant you would do duals, and that creates some of the same effect as a sum. I misspoke. You would not do alpha theta frontally generally. There are historically a few people who've tried that in the field. As far as I know, it never works. I've never heard of it being a good idea. Although, Sieber and Fisher's trauma protocols are theta in the orbitofrontal regions, FPO2, F2, etc. So those may be doing theta surge release things that are not at all the same, because the tissue is different, that you're doing it under, but some of the theories about releasing new states may be similar for doing theta reward prefrontally, a la Sieber and Fisher for trauma, as doing theta rewards posteriorly for awareness and emotional access. So you wouldn't do alpha theta frontally because you don't need alpha frontally, basically. But you might do theta rewards under some very narrow goal states. So, all right, let me stop my session here before I overtrain and cook myself too much. And I will, of course, hang out with you guys and answer any more questions you have. Madeline's asking, question if I'm familiar with Jill Bolte Taylor, who had a left hemisphere stroke and claimed the right side is responsible for feeling oneness. Yeah. In terms of that specific claim, my hunch is she had a temporal lobe experience, either the frontal stroke was also pushing on the temporal lobe, or some of her autism was changed briefly. Because remember, wait, I'm sorry, I'm getting Jill Bolte Taylor conflated with Temple Grandin. I read Jill Bolte Taylor's letter or essay on what she experienced, and I remember noticing several different aspects of consciousness that she felt change, that we could almost like track as a mechanical process. So my hunch is that because of the oneness, she was getting a medial temporal lobe, not a seizure, but like an inflammatory event. You know, with a bleed, you're going to have glutamate everywhere. And the brain does not deal very well with iron or blood being in the actual tissue. So my guess is she was having essentially temporal lobe seizures or temporal lobe irritation when she was experiencing oneness. There's a somewhat well understood, or at least frequently reported phenomena where stimulation of the medial temporal lobe will create this profound experience of being one with existence. You know, it's sometimes called the God spot. There was a squid-based helmet. I forget what the technology is behind squid. I think it's essentially a PET device, a PET, that was zapping temporal lobes with energy, kind of like an MRI or a TMS can do, and creating some experiences of oneness with God and the world. And I think there's been some hypotheses around temporal lobe epilepsy, TLE, maybe being some of what's behind the classic ecstatic visions that we read about in the Bible and other classic books like that. Some of that might be TLE, feeling God speak to you, feeling one with God. There's also an amazing set of essays. I'm blanking who the author is. The Gillian James and the Bicameral Mind is the name of the book. And it's the idea that left and right hemispheric laterality is something that developed somewhat recently, you know, several thousands of years ago. And this does sort of make sense. If you look back at the evolutionary record, there's this time frame like 20,000 years ago or so where brain size started to explode. And we're not exactly sure why. In between 20,000 and about 12,000 years ago, massive elaboration of tissues in many of the human-like creatures seem to be showing up. And this was probably what really developed language and tool use and abstract thought and all those things essentially happening. But there's some thought that non-dominant hemisphere language, your other hemisphere speaking to you, may have been the basis of early religion. So our mystics are crazy and they're hearing voices. Now, sure, but back then, thousands of years ago, some of the basis for feeling one with an animistic world may have been not being as in touch with a non-dominant language system in our brain, while the brain was developing into having more of a unilateral language system. Those of us with bilateral language or alternate hemisphere language may end up having had these other temporal lobe experiences, perhaps. So Gillian James and the Origin of Thought in the Bicameral Mind. I forget the name of the book. I will dig it up and put it in the show notes tomorrow or the next day as well, if you're watching this later or want to come back. So let's see. Other questions. Yeah, Madeline thinks the Jill Bolte Taylor's stroke was temporal. So that's probably what was going on, is pressure from the bleed causing electrical discharge in the temporal lobe, causing essentially a TLE, temporal lobe epilepsy kind of experience, or spiritual oneness and ecstasy, which doesn't always happen with TLE. You can also just like hallucinate and have, you know, intrusive thoughts, or a tic. Tourette's, for instance, can be that kind of phenomena. Joshua was telling us that this concept was covered in the recent Avatar Way of Water movie. Epilepsy or spiritual experience, they can be both, maybe, right? Don't know. And just because it's epilepsy, just because it's a seizure, far be it from me to tell you that doesn't mean it's also not validly spiritual. Maybe that's the way we have spiritual experiences. Maybe there's, you know, for some people, maybe that's how the door opens. I don't know. I'm a bit agnostic to that, pun intended. El Chatarino has said, like Office Space getting stuck in the trance. Maybe, I'm not sure the reference. Radar Ashwood's asking, does any of the benefits of CZSMR on the vertex come from the fact that it straddles both hemispheres and is maybe stabilizing like a bipolar interhemispheric protocol? Probably. I think it might be simpler. I think that if you do CZ minus A1 or CZ minus linked ears, I think you just get a more gentle, broad SMR effect, and you're able to pick up SMR on the vertex, on the right side, on the left side. Because CZ is in the middle of the head, it's going to share the most summed information from both sides. So 50% on the electrode, 50% from everywhere else. But if you're in the middle, the contributions of the everything else will be roughly equal from both sides. So I think doing CZ, even minus A1 training, is doing a more global C-strip SMR enhancement generally. That's my thought on that. Well, guys, thanks for hanging out with me tonight on this Monday evening, or if you're watching it later, thanks for watching it. As always, I'm Dr. Andrew Hill, owner of Peak Brain, co-founder of True Brain. If you would like a brain map, we have the world's best deal. Come to an office. If you're not near an office, we can work with you anyways. A lot of our clients do neurofeedback from home, about 80%, including brain mapping. So we have lots of availability all around the world. If you want to learn your brain, come find me. If you're just a YouTuber watching videos, awesome. Please watch a few more. Those of you who are here or watching later, please give this video a like. Please give the channel a subscribe. And do me a favor and find a video or two to comment on, to boost, or to share with your friends, because YouTube loves that. I think next week I might go back into a basic topic, another brainwave. You guys seem to really enjoy last week's rant on alpha waves. I got a lot of direct messages about that one. People seem to really enjoy digging into some basics. And so tonight was kind of like that, but a bit deeper. And then maybe next week I'll go into some other basic brainwave science and go back and forth a bit for a couple of weeks. So if there's things you want to learn, come ask me. If you have questions about your brain, come find me. And otherwise, until I talk to you guys next, take care of those brains, and I will talk to you